Hello, my name is Cheley. I'm the Wialon hosting expert in the development department. Welcome to the webinar for developers. We continue a series of webinars dedicated to the development based on the Wialon SDK. Today's webinar will be dedicated to JS Wialon API and will take about an hour. And now I'll tell you more about the plan of the webinar. For those who have joined us just today, also I hope that we already have regular viewers. Let me remind you that the webinars we mainly talk about the remote API, but we also touch on topics on the JavaScript API method. The webinars will be useful primarily for those who would like to understand the Wialon SDK. What is it, how to start to working with it, and what you need to know for this. These webinars will be useful to both technical specialists and software developers who have just started working with the Wialon SDK, as well as other specialists, for example, business analysts, who set tasks and explain some points to developers. All the webinars are available on our YouTube channel. Feel free to watch them. If you have any ideas, suggestions that you would like to discuss, or maybe you have come across some difficulties and need advice on a specific topic, please write on the forum for developers. There is a thread dedicated to webinars. A link to it is in the description below. You can also write in the YouTube chat during today's webinar. We will certainly take into account your wishes and ideas when choosing new topics for webinars. In our last webinar, we talked about how to get started with the Wialon JS API. We decided to cover JS methods that are used in many of our apps and Wialon itself. Besides, I code in JavaScript all the examples and the template of a page that I show you. And this language is more convenient to use in JS apps, namely in Wialon JS API. In the last webinar, a link to it is in the description below this video. We studied how to log in into the system, what are the options for making an authorization page for app. Let's move on. We are getting closer and closer to the final result, which is creating a simple single-page web app. Our next step is filling the app with data and rendering the data on web page. And today we will talk about several interesting and useful JS methods, how to use them in a better way, what are their distinctive features. The load library method for downloading necessary libraries, the getItem and getItems method for getting data about an element, the remoteCall method for executing remote requests to the server, the getDriver method for obtaining data about a driver, and driver dashboard, the example of driver data visualization on a web page. So let's start. Before we continue filling the app with data, I'll show you a template of examples, how and what data can be displayed. Let's take a closer look at the methods that we are going to use in example. You can see now on the screen, on the slide, the list of this method: load library, getItem and getItems, remoteCall, and getDriver methods. Let's start with the load library method. This method is used to load libraries. Thanks to these libraries, we can use the required methods for various items. For example, the item icon library for working with item icons. So let's take an example of how we use this method. Now start with the load library method. This method is used to load. Now I will show you where we can find this method in the documentation. We just open our documentation. Here the documentation for JavaScript API is placed in the same place like the remote API documentation, sdk.wialon.com. You can see this part, JavaScript API, and we just open JavaScript API documentation. Here is this one. I open it, new page, and find the method load library. You can see that it's a very simple syntax. You just specify in the brackets the library name in quotes. Here you also can find all possible libraries which you can, and their short description which you can use. Let's look at good example in our playground tool. Playground tool is very useful tool which can use to look the code, to play with code, and etc. to understand how the JS method working. So I open the example get units. Let's show you another example. Comments. It's better example. You can see this here. We load library named unit comments definition. And if I commit this string and will try to run the example, you can see I get the error get comment definition is not a function. It means that there is no special library to work with comments method, comment methods. So let's return. I add this required library, session load library. You can note that method load library is executed from object session. We get Wialon core session, get instance of current session, and then from this object we execute this method. So now I run example, and you can see everything is fine, no errors, and the comment is working. So there is the main sense of this method load library that upload required methods to work with required methods. So let's move on. The next method that we talk about is getItem methods and getItems methods. GetItem method is using to get data for a specific item through its ID, and getItems method is used to getting data for a group of items. So again, let's find this method in documentation. You can see that the syntax is very simple. Only the ID of the item in the brackets for method getItems. Okay, it's better if I show you on my screen. The same you can find in our documentation. GetItem. We find that yes, here once getItem method. Here we specify item ID, internal ID, and getItems method. Here we specify the items type like avail unit group, avail resource, avail retranslator, user. So let's look on the playground again. to see how this method works and when it's better to use it. Now we will look the example getUnits. You can note here again we use method load library to upload item icon to get icons for units. And next we get from the session the method getItems is also executed from object session. We get getItems, we get unit, aval unit, specify in the bracket items type aval unit. We will get a collection of units, and then with cycle for each unit we can get its ID and its name. You can see that here we get a list of the unit. And then when we get already unit ID, we can execute method getItem, here one, to get information about, to get data about certain units. For example, like here I select this unit ID and get information here about this unit. So if you don't know the item ID, you can use method getItems to get a collection of some elements, and then for each elements in collection you can get their ID, their name, further using their get ID in other requests. Okay, so let's move on. Let's move on our now I would like to tell about a very cool and useful method which named remoteCall. You can see I hope you can see there on the screen. You can see on slide the syntax of this method. And this method is used if there is no corresponding JS method for executing the required API request. For example, the events request group, request for working with events. Then you can execute an API request through the remoteCall method. You can look at the syntax on the slide. We call this method from the remote object. The name of the SVC request is specified in brackets. The parameters of the request params, all these you get from the remote API documentation, the same like for simple remote API request. The callback function and the timeout for the execution of the request are optional parameters. So let's take a look at how this method works in a code. I will show you my code example now. I will open my code, and you can see that here I create remote object. So Wialon core remote get instance. I create remote object for current session, and then before I specified parameters to execute my request. Here in example, I execute request search item. I want to get some specific unit, and I don't use the method getItem because I don't already know the unit ID, and the method getItems also doesn't work for me because I would like to get units with specific criteria, like the name with name Volva and which belongs to my user. So you can see I specify criteria name and user creator name. Here I specify all required parameters that need for request core research item. And then I just execute method remoteCall from remote. Here I specify name of SVC command, core research item, parameters for this request for core research item, and then I specify a callback function which will proceed my result from request core research items and display it on the screen. Let's look the example on the web page. We log in. Okay, and you can see that I get a list of the units. If you open the console, let's log in again. You can see that the remote request core search item has been sent to the server, and the response from them will be proceeded. Sorry, not so request. The response from the server has been proceeded by my code. Let's show you again one more time, just to show you the result from the server. Yeah, here one. So you can see that my code has been proceeded this result. I get items, I get each items in the collection in my sieve, then I get name and etc. You can see that how I displayed information about units for my web page. So it's about remoteCall method. Any API method can be executed the same way. Later we will look more about this method in other code samples. There is only one thing to note here, that the remoteCall method executes AJAX to the service. In other words, it's executed in parallel. And if you need to process the data immediately and display, for example, it on web page or calculate something, then you need definitely to perform the callback function and specify it in the way the data will be displayed. The same as like in my example, which I have showed you. So we have considered most of useful methods, and even one remoteCall method allows you to perform any API requests, so we can move on directly to filling our app with data. But before we start, I would like to tell you about one more method and then answer your questions if there are any in the YouTube chat. Another interesting method is the getDriver method for getting information about the driver. Like with getItems, here the getDrivers method is also used to get the collection of drivers. And you can also get drivers ID this way. You can see the syntax of this method on your screen on the slide. Both methods are called for the resource object. The syntax is simple. There are no parameters for getDrivers. For getDrivers, the driver ID is indicated in the brackets. Besides, to work with this method, you must first load the resource drivers library. So let's take a look at an example. There is an example of a management driver in the playground. I will show you now on my screen. We open the documentation again. Oh no, we already go to the playground example, and here find example manage driver. You can see that required library has been loaded, and then to get driver information, first we get information about resource ID. Here we get all collection of all resource. Then we specify then we get each ID of resource. You can see the list of the all resource, and when I select some resource, this information we get drivers information. So for this certain resource, we execute method getDrivers. So we get a collection of drivers where we can get their ID and name. And after, when I get driver's name, driver's ID, we can get more information about drivers. So, for example, here, driver, we execute method getDriver and specify driver ID, which we get above. So it's similar as the working with getItem and getItems method. If you don't know the driver's ID, you can first get all drivers with and execute method getDrivers without any parameters, and then from the collection of drivers, you can use cycle for each element in collection, get own driver ID or driver name, and then you can use this driver ID in other requests. Okay, so the theoretical part is over. Let me answer your questions if there any are. And next we will take a look at even more coding example. Let me check if we have some questions. Oh, there is not questions in the chat. It's nice that everything, I hope, is clear and simple. In any case, if you have some questions, some struggles with later, you can write on our forum or to my email or even here in comments in YouTube and so on, where it's possible, and we can discuss it later, or I will answer later your questions. So the second part is practical. It's about filling the app with data. Now I will show you an example of my code where I use the method that we have already started, and I will also show you how I visualize the data on a web page. It's like only template which you can use, but later we will fill more data into the app, and finally I hope we get some single page web application. So let's open my example. First I will show you the example here. Also, I would like to remind that all example to codes you can find in the description below under this video, and you can use or you can look through later more carefully. So we use some like this app. We get some information about our drivers. For example, we get some driver's card. And here, for example, we get here a setter state. Later, I will show you the exact parameters about it. Yeah, something like this is very simple and maybe useful template for you for your task. So let's open my code. If we start investigate the HTML page, it's just a simple page. In previous webinar, I have explained how you can add the login page, how you can construct the login page. So here I used iframe. I use iframe to our login authorization form. You know that the first login should be only through our special login authorization form. Who haven't yet watched this webinar, you can do it. Again, it can be used several ways. For example, you can already have on your HTML page all required blocks to fill information, to fill data. But in this case, I will construct new blocks, new HTML code by using JavaScript, using like online. So let's open GS code. Just for repeating, the same, we use function token resolve to get token information. Then when we have a token, we can log in into session. We log in into session and execute call init function as main code. For init function, I have loaded the necessary libraries like resource drivers and resource accounts. Resource accounts is not needed right now, but resource drivers is needed because I need to get information about drivers from resource. Here also I update session with required flags to get information, because if I specify, for example, only base flag, I cannot get information about driver from resource. And then I execute function getDriver info to get information about my drivers. And here you can see that I have construct a special list with my with special blocks, and then I have get current session. Again, I get instance of current session because before in this session I have uploaded required flags, and that I wouldn't repeat it again. So I just use the parameter, the local parameter var says, to get current session with all required flags. After here, I execute method getItems from my session. I need to get resource, so I specify avail resource. And then here is just simple like life hack. I know that I have only one resource, one required resource. So here I specify res with index 0, first element in my collection, which returns from here. And for this resource, first resource, I execute method getDrivers to get all my drivers. And again, then I created new block, new div element with special class card columns. I used Bootstrap framework. It's very useful, inconvenient, and nice framework where you already have some nice templates to use in your code. So I have selected this class type, these templates like card columns, and here for each driver, then I get each driver from my drivers massive array, from my drivers array. Drivers is array collection, drivers collection. For each drivers, I get information and create the special card, the special block for each driver, where I get, for example, like index I use driver.n driver name, I use driver.ds driver description, I use driver pair is a driver phone, and etc. All this information, what does it mean, ds, pair, and n, you can find in documentation. A little bit later I will show you the place where you can find this description for this parameter, and etc. I get other information, and also I perform some calculation to specify the driver information. Here I create function getDriver status, where I pass as parameter my driver. Driver means elements from drivers collection. And here I get information about driver status, like walking, running, driving, or rest. This information is stored in special parameter name infer, and there is also all description about this parameter in our documentation, and I just use the some parameters from infer and specify if my drivers walk, rest, walk, or drive. And then I also calculate a time, for example, how much this current station is last. So it's the same like in our Wialon interface. You can see the pop-up about driver information, about driver status information. The good way is that you can use these parameters from infer parameter and calculate your own rules, because as I know, in some countries, in some laws, different countries can have different rules for driver status, for driver information, how much walk, for example, 9 or 10 hours, or even 7, how much rest they need. And in our Wialon, there is basic functionality for this information, the basic rules. But if you need some specific for your customers, you can calculate on your side and show a pop-up in your app with rules which corresponding to specific laws, for example. That's all. So it's not so difficult. Let's look again. Here you can get like show height information. Here you can find, yes, and sure, you can add any other information from the driver. Okay, let's open the documentation where you can find this one, the information about driver. You need to go to part data format, resources, and select drivers. Drivers, here one. And here you can see all description for each parameter which driver element can have. For example, ID and, or like in my example, DS is like description for driver, phone number, binded unit, the same I used at my app. Oh, here one. I show unit, I get unit ID. I get unit ID. Let's check. I'm sorry. I get unit ID. We can return to my code. I get unit ID, and then I get by method getItem. As I know, unit ID driver.bu driver.bu binded unit, I can get information about unit, about this unit name, for example, unit get name or other information. So you can get binded unit, you can get previous binded unit, time of last binding and binding, so you can also show this information about position. If about position, there is one note. If driver is bound to unit, the position will be null. So you need to get information about last position from unit. But if the driver is not bound to unit, you will get his last position from driver's element. And then parameters info, analysis infringement of work and the rest of drivers. And these all parameters are calculated on the server side, on backend. So you just get the current activity, the start time on this activity, and there are other more parameters which you can use in your calculation on your web app. So I think sure, here you can get their driver code name, driver code, and other required information. Custom fields, you can specify any custom fields for drivers and get it, and any other good information. So I think that's all about my example, my template example. And let me check again the chat. Maybe we have get some questions. Mark Wojtovich asks, do I remember correctly that session seed will time out after 5 minutes if no API calls are made? If we don't use avail events, it's some other keep alive method recommended so the session remains active. Mark, you're right. If there is not executed any API request to the server, the session lasts 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, the session will be closed automatically. And to keep session, it needs to execute avail events request. For example, every 2 seconds, every 1 minute, even you can execute avail events request and consider JavaScript methods when you use the Wialon JavaScript API, the good thing is these avail events requests are performed automatically. For example, you can see if you open a console, for example, in my examples, you can see that avail events will be executed automatically, but there is not any string, any code in my example. So it's just like embedded function in Wialon JavaScript API. But if you don't use Wialon JavaScript API, and you just need to execute any API request, like let's say, or you can see on my screen that there is nothing due on the web page, but every 2 seconds avail events requests are executed. The same you can see in Wialon or other our app. And if you don't use JavaScript Wialon API, you need to execute any request, for example, every 5 minutes. And if in due to your task, to your app, doesn't need, you need to execute avail event. So there is only one way to send some request to server to hold session, and the most simple way to execute avail events request as it doesn't need to specify special parameters. That's great. Thank you. Okay, fine. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark, for your questions. It's a good question. I think that's all for today. We have become one step closer to creating a small ready-made single-page web app. We already know how to create an authorization page, login, and fill the app with the required data. Next time, we will discuss some more useful methods. For example, reloading the page without relogging. I think you have noted that every time when I update page, I need to log in again, and we will find a way to skip this action. And filling the app with a little more data, I think I find more interesting examples, interesting template for our little app. So thank you for your attention, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done already, like the videos that seems interesting to you, so we will better understand which topics were the most useful to you. Hit the bell button to get notification every time we release new videos. See you at the next webinars. Goodbye.